This is Heidi Helf, and you're listening to the Agile Uprising podcast.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Agile Uprising podcast. I'm Colleen Johnson, and my co-host today is Hrcsko.
Hello.
Hello, and we are joined today by Molood Ceccarelli. Hello, Nuri.
Oh, hello.
Hello, Molood.
Hello.
Today we're going to be talking about finding success with remote agile teams. And we're very lucky today to be joined by Molood. She is the founder of the Remote Forever conference in its, or Remote Forever Summit in its second year this year. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Great. Well, we're really excited to be talking to you today about how to find success for agile teams that are remote or have some people remote, because it's the reality definitely of the industry we work in that everybody is distributed. And I think there are a lot of strong beliefs that you can't be successful with remote agile teams. Is that something you run into a lot in this space?
Absolutely. Why do you think I exist?
What would you say, based on your experience, what percentage of teams in our industry are remote?
I don't have the actual data to say, how many percent are remote, but I have only seen one co-located team in all the years that I've been in the Agile space. So for me, it's above 90%, but I bet that there are a lot of Agile coaches out there who have only seen co-located teams and have really never worked with remote teams.
Okay.
So, yeah.
How about you, Jay? Do you have any experience with remote teams?
So my last transformation was all co-located. So everybody was in the same building, which was, I've come to learn, a very, very unique experience. My newest transformation I'm currently working on, it is almost completely distributed in the sense that I have come across maybe a handful of teams so far in our journey that are all in the same building. But for the most part, everybody's distributed. And I actually, before this meeting, I pulled up, every year we do a comparison of the version 1 State of Agile report. And when you're talking percentages, last year, 79% of their respondents said that they manage some sort of distributed teams, and 40% said they use Agile to manage a distributed outsourced development team. So Molood, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that, because I think that adds another layer of complexity. There's one thing to have remote captive resources and then distributed captive resources, and then to have a distributed third party. I can only imagine that makes things that much more complex.
Absolutely, it does. Stakes are different, interests are different, layers of reporting are different. So definitely it adds a level of complexity.
As we dig into this a little bit more, I guess one question I would have for both of you is there a difference when we say remote versus distributed? I'm curious if you guys use those interchangeably, or if there's a distinction to be made.
You want to go first?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it. I know a lot of the problems we have in our Agile world is a lot around nomenclature, and I guess we should be more specific. For me personally, when I think distributed, I think teams of people where they may be on site, they may be offshore, they may be nearshore, but it's almost a mix, a buffet, if you will, of different locations. Where realistically, if we say remote teams, I would probably think of that as a wholly encapsulated team offshore. So like in my last job when I did banking, we had a captive resource team offshore in Pune. So they weren't distributed per se, they were all co-located, but they were remote, which obviously adds a whole different level of insanity. How about you, Molood?
I kind of agree with what you just said, but I am a bit more careful about how I use the two words myself. As you said, when you say remote, it creates this image of individuals sitting remotely and collaborating together, or individuals sitting, as satellite people and collaborating with a team that is co-located. Whereas when you say distributed, the image that is imagined usually is clusters of people sitting together and collaborating. I think Mark Kilby has a really good definition of different levels of distribution. But when I use distributed and remote, I usually mean the same thing, but I know that for people, it means different things.
So when Molood, I think it would be interesting for you to share a little bit about how you jumped into this space and kind of became an expert in the field specifically for Agile teams. What brought you to this point in your career?
That's a good question. I started my career as a security engineer, and I ended up in testing and test integration, and I discovered Agile along the way. I have, the habit of sitting and retrospecting my week every Sunday. One of those Sundays, I realized I really enjoy this Agile way of working, and I'm struggling all the time to make this work. And one realization that I had was that every single team that I had ever worked with was distributed. So it blew my mind. It puzzled me at first, and then it blew my mind. And I thought, it says in the manifesto principles that you have to be face-to-face and you have to be collocated. And every single article that I have ever read is recommending collocation. But the reality is otherwise. How can I work with this reality? And then I started researching, and I immersed myself into this space. I talked to people who are also in this space. I talked to experts at remote work, and I also talked to experts at Agile. And then I tried to bring these two together.
Yeah, it's definitely needed. What are when you started digging in and bringing all of those experts together? What were some of the biggest challenges that you were trying to solve for?
I know that the expectation right now is for me to say communication, but the truth is it wasn't communication. It was mindsets, and it was patterns of behavior that people had learned over the years. And Agile was already in play, at play for quite a long time. When I entered this world, when I discovered Agile, it was around 2011. And Agile has been around since 2001. So I was I was very late to the party. But what I discovered was that people had been using practices, tools, different visualizations, radiators, and they had formed habits, even in their own Agile ways of working, that needed to be unlearned. And those habits needed to be replaced by new habits, because we are empowered by technology and we have the chance to work remotely and collaborate together.
How about you, Jay? What have you seen that are some of the biggest challenges?
I think the biggest challenge we run into is really comes down to, Molood joked to say communication, but it always comes down to communication. And what I've seen is my experience is a lot of larger enterprise type orgs. There are so many tools nowadays available that will allow you to collaborate in real time via video, via chat, stuff like Slack, like Mattermost, Microsoft Teams is a new thing. All these video, like what we're using now, Zoom and Skype. There's all these different tools that, because these companies have this long supply chain, supplier negotiation, they're not as quick to spin up and use some of these tools. So unfortunately, you make these teams suffer through this bad experience of trying to work remotely only over the phone or only over email. We all know email and instant messenger, two of the worst forms of communication because they're so easily misconstrued. I do think communication is key. But I also think that a company or an organization that's really serious about having their distributed teams succeed, they need to invest in the tooling, as silly as it sounds, to help them succeed. Otherwise, you're putting a giant rock in their path and not giving them a way around it, and then complaining that they're not moving fast enough. It's like, well, what do you expect?
Yeah, I think I've heard David Horowitz, who owns Retrium, he has talked about the concept of if one person is remote, then everyone's remote, which I have seen a lot of organizations kind of push that culture, to your point, Jay, like with around the tools for communication, just to level that out so that you're not the odd one trying to dial in from home, or the odd one trying to participate via video when everybody else is in the room together. Molood, do you use any kind of hard and fast rules around that for teams where part of the team is together and other people are not?
Definitely, tools are a necessary part of creating effective communication, but I want to circle back to what I said earlier, that is, in order for the communication to become effective, we need to change the way we think and the way that we behave. So if you have a part of the team that are collocated, and you have like a few people who sit remotely in different countries or different cities, or even just a different building in the same city, the way that you collaborate needs to change. For example, you as a person who is co-located with other people might, have a conversation at the office and make a decision and completely forget to inform the people who are remote. And 2 weeks later, those people are like, what just happened? And you're like, yeah, we had a meeting about this. We made that decision. And they never were in the loop. So one thing that we need to change is to refer to what you just said. If a person is remote, then everybody is remote. What does that mean? That means if a meeting is happening amongst the people that are co-located, they need to imagine how would it impact the people who are remote and include them in the conversation. And there are different ways to do that. One way is to inform them after the decision is made, but also make it a habit to always do that. Another way is to not have those kind of conversations verbally, but rather have them in writing, in a chat messenger, in the tool that you use for communication, so that the remote people are also included. So again, it's about unlearning or changing the habits that we use or that we are used to work with, and replacing that with a remote first thinking or a remote first culture.
Yeah, it's interesting that you said that about just the following up on the decisions made. I mean, all of these things are probably just great practices and habits to put in place, regardless of your team's distribution or location, and easy things to forget. I know for Agile Uprising, we are all distributed and use Slack for a lot of our communication. It can get daunting at times when you have, if you've been busy or been traveling and pop out and then go to log in and there's, 60 messages from the last 2 days to try to catch up. Do you have tips or tricks that you recommend for how to flag key decisions like that? Or I guess tease apart the critical communication from the banter, because the banter's good, I think, from a team building perspective, but I think the critical decisions can get lost in the shuffle sometimes.
I go with simplicity. I always recommend people to use one tool where all the information can be accessed through, and it's simple enough and it's easy enough to find all the links, the accumulation of all the information that people need to know. Some people use Confluence, and they have a landing page on Confluence where, all the links to all the different parts of the database is there. Some people use Basecamp. So there are so many different tools. There's Trello. There's all these many tools. But what I go for is put the key decisions on that main page where everybody can access, and keep that main page small enough and simple enough that you don't have to scroll so much to find the information, or you don't have to search for finding a relevant documentation. And tagging, which we are all used to in social media, it also exists in a lot of tools that are used for creating information radiators. The same for the examples that I gave earlier, Trello, Basecamp, even Confluence, they all have this functionality of tagging. So if you are sure that someone needs to have that information, use that pretty @ sign and make sure that they get that information. But as we're moving away from email and we're moving to these visualization tools and chat messenger tools, it's also important to have a conversation or have at least a strategy about how to inform people, how to broadcast information to people. One thing I've done, for example, for the summit is we use Slack as a community management tool. And, in Slack, the general channel is a default channel that everybody joins as they join the workspace. We only use that channel for making announcements to everybody. So we don't mix it up with all staff communication. So we have created an identical channel to general where people can talk to everybody and they can, have information spread around. But the general channel is only used for announcing key decisions or key information that everybody needs to be aware of. So it's more like a top-down approach versus using the other channel for a more collaborative approach. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. Let's see here. What are some of the myths? So you said, communication is often touted as the thing that's the hardest to fix or the hardest challenge. What are some of the other myths that you've run into about working with Agile remote teams?
It's not unique to Agile. It's about remote working. There is this myth that people who work remotely don't really work. Some people even put their hands up and show this double quotation mark, and they say work from home as if it's not really working. And the reality is that people who work remotely usually are very bad at disciplining themselves and their time, and they end up working more hours compared to the people in the office. They have less interruptions because they have control over their environment. And the myth is managers, leaders, they think that people who work remotely are working less, whereas the reality is the exact opposite. Other myths that I could think about, that remote people always work in their pajamas. I mean, what else could I say? Remote people don't know how to communicate. Like they are introverted and they want to be alone, or they are alone. And I think that when I work remotely, I actually feel a lot more connected to people that I'm communicating with. I laugh out loud chatting with someone, and I know that people sitting around me in a cafe wonder, who is this crazy person laughing on their own. But the thing is, I actually do feel connected because I am voluntarily choosing to interact with those people. Whereas when I'm in an office, I get interrupted. So I feel annoyed that I'm that I'm interacting with people involuntarily.
Well, let me ask you this. You made a good point. I think you're the second guest to bring up the fact that there's this preconceived notion that when you work from home, you're basically just, mailing it in. And bosses think that, we're all out in Bali having a good time. We're actually, you're absolutely right. The days I work from home, I log on, I'm on at 8 o'clock. I make sure I only take, less than an hour lunch because I don't want to miss anything. Do you think that could be maybe generational, and maybe because we are used to, and I guess you, myself, Colleen, our age demographic, do you think because we come from technology and we're more comfortable with working with people who aren't sitting in front of you, whereas maybe my dad's generation or those a little bit older than us are not used to that? Do you think maybe that has something to do with it, where there's that managerial control thing where they think they're losing control? Could that be part of it that causes some of that concern?
I think it does play a role, and I like that you brought it up. I recently had a talk, and one of the slides that I had put on that talk was the technology natives are in their 30s. They are leading organizations. They are forming the corporate culture. We are those people. So if you want to join the future of work, the future of Agile, that's how we work. So I believe that what you say is actually true, that generation does play a role. But I've also seen, on the other hand, I've seen people of our age, millennials and technology natives, basically, who are falling for that fear of losing control, fear of not knowing if a person is working, if they can't see them. But then again, I have to go back to the first point I made. That is, these are habits that are built from the experiences that we get. So if you graduate from college and your first job is in a big corporation where your manager needs to see you work, you need to punch in hours and punch out when you go out of the office, and you're getting paid for your presence and not for the results or for your being productive, these habits get formed gradually. So even after 2 years of working in that environment, changing that becomes harder. So then again, doesn't matter what your age is. It matters what habits, what circumstances you've been brought up in, or you have basically been exposed to in your work life.
Right. It almost becomes cultural as opposed to behavioral. It's just something that's embedded in what you're used to. So you almost you default to it as a norm.
Yeah, exactly. Just imagine people who have only ever used Git and GitHub for coding. Imagine giving them a different version control system that is not distributed, something like ClearCase. Even the vocabulary is different. It's very hard for them to think that way. And the same applies when people want to move from ClearCase to Git,
Right. It would cause a riot. People would be screaming and yelling and throwing things.
You guys made me laugh, though. I spend a lot of days working from home now, and my mom comes to help me with my new baby. And I feel fairly confident saying this because I know she won't be listening to the podcast, but she makes me laugh when I try to work from home because she will talk at me while I have my headphones on. I can be like, I'm on a conference call. Like the concept that I'm trying to work is so lost to her because she's like, but you're at home. And Molood said, you're in yoga pants, so you're clearly not working.
Yeah, definitely.
So I have to leave so I can get anything done. And I do definitely see a little bit of that generational gap of it. It just doesn't make any sense that you could possibly be productive.
Yeah. Speaking of your mother, I actually, my mother is a tailor. She makes wedding dresses for people. And recently when she was visiting and I had to work, I actually encouraged her to do what's it called? Like when you draw the model on a piece of paper before you cut the cloth and make it. I actually have no idea what that's called. But I had her sit with me at a cafe and do that part of her job. And then she actually raised up her hand and said, #remote work.
Out loud.
Yeah, exactly.
Verbal hashtag. That's awesome. Okay, well, let's jump in and talk a little bit about the Remote Forever Summit. So you mentioned that this is the second year of Remote Forever, and you've got an exciting lineup of people this year. Tell us a little bit about what brought you to kick this off last year, and kind of your audience here is a lot of Agile conference goers, both I think local, regional type conferences and the big national conference. So I think everybody will have a good idea of what kind of work goes into putting one of these on, and some of the speakers that you'll be able to share with us.
Definitely. It's a vulnerable story. As I told you earlier on this podcast, when I had one of those Sundays and I was retrospecting and I discovered, man, all the teams I've ever worked with are distributed. And then I started my journey of, Agile and distributed work. They have to go together. It wasn't so articulated at the time, but as I kept working and talking to more and more people, it became super clear to me that these two worlds, by the two worlds, I mean the world of remote work and the world of Agile, live so far apart from each other, but they have so much in common. And as it became clearer and clearer in my head, I thought about creating a conference to bring these two together. And I am a conference organizer. I put events together all the time. I've been doing that since I was a kid. Of course, they weren't professional events when I was a kid, but you get the idea. Like, it's in my genes to bring people together in the form of an educational, informative, sharing, connecting kind of event. The online thing came to be because I thought, what's the value in remote working? It's that you can connect to people from all around the world, regardless of where they are. So there was this light bulb moment that I had, and I thought, this is it. This is what I need to do. I need to create a conference that is online and brings people from Agile and remote work together. And I thought, this is just an idea. I'm going to put the idea out there and see if it works. So I pitched the idea to a few people, and it instantly resonated with a lot of people. And still, I wasn't sure. I thought, okay, I'm going to invite a few people that I know. And of course, there were some people who said no, obviously. They were like, no, this is not for me. But I tried to make it as easy as possible for speakers to say yes to this. And I thought, if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. But at least I've given it a try. So the thought that I had was, it's going to be a conference for maybe 50, 100 people. I don't know, it's just like an MVP. I'm testing it to see if it's viable at all. And then I ended up with a list of over 2,000 people. So,
wow.
Yeah, it wasn't just validated. It was like, this is a gap. This is a need in the industry. And I am here serving and filling that gap. And it's a lot of work. It's really a lot of work. It has taken about a year to put each of these summits together. But I'm very passionate about it because I care so deeply about this topic, about bringing these two worlds together and making sure that everyone has the skills to work remotely when they are in an Agile environment, or to use Agile principles when they are working remotely.
What was the thing that surprised you the most in going through this planning process that was challenging about building a remote conference?
Ooh, there are many surprises. As I told you, I thought it's just going to be a small online meeting, maybe like a webinar for 100, 200 people. And then I had 2,000 people. So I had to be pragmatic, think fast, and act fast. So it was a lot of things that I had to try. There were failures. There was a lot of manual work that went into this because I hadn't thought of automating stuff. I thought it's a small thing. And another thing that really surprised me was how so many of the very well-known people in the Agile world accepted my invitation with open arms. And they said, yes, I definitely want to be part of that because I see this is needed. This is the future. So just getting that kind of that validation from people who I consider to be thought leaders was really heartwarming.
I think it's interesting, and Jay, you can probably weigh in on this too, but I would say we've run into a similar feeling with Agile Uprising, right? In that spirit of, well, let's just throw this out there and ask. And we've had such strong support from the community in terms of speakers, authors, people joining our podcast, people helping us out with the Agile Ask Me Anything program that we've been doing, and it is kind of amazing when you just put the invite out there, how willing people are and excited. It's not necessarily that it's a charity case that they're accepting to do this work with us. It's because they see the need, and I think that they can also appreciate the opportunity to participate in things like Remote Forever. Because they get the opportunity to do it remotely, right? For so many people in our space, we're on the road all the time, and it's exhausting and draining. So I'm sure it's exciting for them to be able to join your conference in their pajamas.
Absolutely. There is also a reason why I have invested my own money to make this available for free. So last year, I wasn't even sure if I was going to make any money from this conference, So I thought, I'm ready to lose this much money as long as I know I've given this idea a try. So to make it available for free is, again, a lot of work.
I can't even imagine. We have, and Colleen, we might be opening the kimono too far here, but Colleen will tell you, Molood, we've debated doing a in-person conference for the Agile Uprising. We've bandied around the idea of a virtual conference, so I might actually come back to you, Molood, and I'll give you commissions if you can help me figure this out. But just the tremendous amount of planning and coordination, even for something which it sounds sort of, we'll just do it remotely, it's easy. No. My hat's off to you, because we've started and failed at least 2 or 3 times trying to get this idea off the ground. So I can only imagine what you planned, a couple hundred, and you ended up with 2,000 responses in your inbox. That had to be just totally wild, amazing, and terrifying simultaneously.
Exactly. You get the feeling very, very accurately.
So one of the things I wanted to ask you, Molood, taking it back towards the idea of remote teams, I came across an idea which I wanted to see if you've heard of it or what your thoughts are. I came across a blog post by ThoughtWorks, the software consultancy firm, and they talked about the concept of a remote anchor, where if you have a distributed team, say I have 3 people onshore and I have 4 people off, right, and they're all sitting around one another, they propose the idea of having one of those people almost as a primary, not like a Scrum Master, master, or not like a team lead, but one of those people who's almost like the ombudsman or the member at large, someone who can help coordinate the communication to make sure, to our earlier point, nothing's lost in translation. I had a little bit of experience with this, and I tried it in my last Scrum mastering role, and it sort of worked. I don't want to jinx myself because they're still yelling. But it sort of worked in the sense that we had at least one person to know, okay, well, I need to get back to Molood and Colleen that this decision was made. Have you ever come across something like that? Have you ever seen an org try and do that to make it work? Any success stories, or am I totally just crazy?
I actually think there is a job title for it that's being posted on remote job boards. It's called Virtual Office Manager.
Wow. Wow, we should have trademarked that. We'd be onto something.
Yeah, I should. So the Virtual Office Manager does not just do the job that the Scrum Master does, but also does the administrative work that people need to do, making sure that people get a proper onboarding, doing a little bit of HR, maybe like making sure that decisions are followed. So of course, it can mean different things in different companies, but that's at least my understanding of it. I definitely think it's a valid job to have, and it's as needed as a Scrum Master is needed for a team to work. It's a facilitative role. We definitely do need that.
Absolutely. I mean, that's wild, but absolutely. I mean, when you think about it, we've had guests before. I think it was Sandy Mamoli who talked about, a holacracy, self-determining organizations, and we had Heidi Helfand talking about, dynamic reteaming. So all this stuff is always going to happen. So I think that idea of having that, at least in name, centralized person who can help make sure that onboarding, right? Something so simple. Do you have a computer? Do you have a login? Do you have a mouse? Can you get in? And with a distributed team, that must get that much more, because if you're really trying to decentralize, that must get that much more complex. So I actually think that idea is brilliant. I'm going to suggest that at work, see what happens. Maybe I get promoted out of it.
Do you find that there's... Oh, go ahead, Molood.
I was just going to add to what Jay said about the fact that holacracy, self-organization, they are all amazing ideas. The reality of the world, however, is that we don't always get to hire all the people or screen all the people that we work with. A lot of times organizations are large and they have to collaborate together across different locations, and not every single individual is skilled at written communication, at working remotely, at communicating effectively in writing, or using information radiators, updating the status of their work, and all the other things that make communication work in a remote team. So having that role of a facilitator, of a person who makes sure that things are actually happening, that conversation, communication is actually effective, is definitely essential, especially to larger organizations that need to collaborate remotely.
Do you find that the role for the Scrum Master goes away on a remote team? So you mentioned the office manager concept, and it sounds like maybe that could overlap with some of the facilitation things that a Scrum Master might do.
Yeah, I think that's what I said, that the office manager is, well, for a development team, it's Scrum Master and more. Okay. If you're not a development team, then the office manager does admin work.
Are there any other roles that you can think of from an Agile perspective where the needs change a lot? How about a product owner?
Product owner is a very debated role in the Agile community, whether remote or not. So I have a theory that is, product owners, they weren't born product owners. There's no the college degree that would teach you how to become a product owner. Most of the product owners that we have, they have either been very good engineers, architects, tech leads. Some of them have been business-oriented people who have come from, the business side of the IT. And there is a third group who come from the process side of IT. Maybe they've been project managers, maybe they've been process engineers, but they're those people. So there is this three groups of people who find themselves in the role of product owner. And I think a great product owner needs to have all three skills, that is business, process, and technology. So to find the perfect person who is really good at all these three areas is almost impossible. It's not exactly impossible because we have great product owners out there. But in general, in the Agile world, there needs to be a lot of collaboration for the role of product owner to really work. So when you go remote and you just have one product owner to manage several different teams, and that product owner has only one or two of those backgrounds and is missing the third one, the element of distribution adds to the challenge. So I don't think it goes away, but I think that the challenge is under-addressed. It's not really well understood. So I think we need to work a little more on that in the Agile world, not just for remote teams, but also for co-located teams.
Yeah. How do you do you have a standard list of questions, or how do you interview people when you know they're going to be remote? Do you have a set of questions or challenges that you look for or look to?
That's a good question. I don't believe in interviewing people by only questions. I believe in interviewing people by actually having them do the job that they're being hired for. So if I am to work with someone remotely and they fail to communicate in writing, that's a definite no from the start. They need to be responsive. They need to be clear when they're writing. They need to be able to communicate humor, for example, if the team that I'm working with is using humor as a practice of their way of communicating. Sometimes, younger teams, IT teams, they are fluent in GIFs. If a new hire is not fluent in GIFs, that's not a culture match. So culture match and the ability to work remotely is the most important thing for me. It's a lot more important than a list of questions to go through, to be honest.
And I'll jump in, Colleen. I think that's been really tough for in a lot of my career when we have to interview someone who's going to be remote because, Molood, you make great points, the cultural fit, right? The sense of humor, the teams that interact with each other in GIFs and memes, right? That's something that's, very quickly can get, you could not lose control, but you could start off on the wrong foot and go down a path that you don't really want to go to.
Exactly.
For me, remote work I honestly, when I have to interview people who aren't going to be sitting in front of me, I interview like I would interview anybody else. And then it's, I will say this, if they're typing, if their spelling is horrendous, right? Like IMs and email becomes that much more important when you're not sitting in front of somebody. And if I can barely understand what you're trying to say, even with spell check, it's like, okay, that's probably a big, to your point, Colleen, a big giant flashing no-no. But other than that, I really try and interview people just the way I normally would. I mean, more of a conversation than an interview, but it does add a different level of complexity if that person is not going to pick up on the visual clues of when I make a remark that I'm being snarky and I'm not being sincere, or on some of just the facial expressions that people give that can give away what they're going to say before they say it. It does add it seems like a common theme in this conversation. It does add a huge level of complexity when it comes to personal communication, reading the room, understanding what the general feeling is. That gets tough.
Yeah, I remember just a few minutes ago, we were talking about the generational gap. And I think that the generation that were born in the 80s and later, we are very used to chatting with our friends. We are very comfortable writing to our spouses, to our partners, to whoever we are communicating with. Sending a text comes very, very naturally to us. So if you can do that in personal life, but you fail to do that in your professional life, you're not fit to do remote work yet. You need to practice to be able to communicate your professional concepts and ideas as well in writing. And it can't be like, hey, I need to talk to this colleague and I can't because they're not in the same office as me. So I have to wait until next time that they fly to the city so I can have that conversation with them. With that mentality, remote work is not for you.
That's actually brilliant. If you can do it in your personal life and yet you can't do it in your professional life, that's actually awesome. I'm going to write that down. I'm going to send that to some people. But you're right, though. I mean, if I'm very comfortable pulling up my text message and sending my wife a text, right? But I can't do it at work, or I'm not comfortable doing it at work. I need that person in front of me. It's a bit. There's something going on there, right? I mean, I'm also a big proponent of, there was an old manager said to me once, Why call when you can write? Why write when you can call? Why call when you can stop by? So I'm a big fan of just pick up the phone, right? If it's a 5-minute conversation, instead of me turning this into an IM, it's going to be, hey, Molood, you got a second? I want to run something by you, and then just pick up the phone. Plus, it adds that other dimension of hearing the voices, but also you can sort of infer the unsaid saids by what someone's saying in their voice. I'm a big fan of that. And I think getting comfortable talking to people, to your point, Molood, with the technology natives and the millennials who are used to texting, we run the risk of whipsawing that pendulum too far in the other direction, where people use typing as a default communication. And
I am definitely guilty of that. I am totally guilty of that. But there is something that, again, like some other example that comes to mind when thinking about how we use text and phone properly in our personal life, but we somehow fail to use it properly in professional life. Imagine you get into a heated written text message with your spouse, and you immediately sense that there is something wrong. What do? You say, there seems to be a misunderstanding. Let's have a call, right? You want to resolve the conflict right away using an actual phone call. Or you say, you know what, let's just meet. Let's stop texting and meet each other. But in a professional life, you keep writing and you keep creating this conflict and you keep on going deeper and deeper. Why can't you just apply the same set of skills?
Right, you almost double down and make a bad situation worse.
Yep, that's funny. Well, one other question for you, Molood, on and you too, Jay. Like, what's the most surprising hack that you've seen for remote teams? And I want to share one with you guys to get you thinking about this. That somebody showed me, and it's very simple, but I love it. I worked with a team that was all remote, and they had dry erase paddles. I don't actually know what the original intent of them was for. And I have to give props to Melissa Boggs for this one. And they did story pointing on these paddles over video so that they could write their point value on the paddle and then hold the paddle up for the screen, which I thought was a cool way to hack the traditional story pointing and kind of get around having to use a pointing specific or a tool specifically for story pointing with remote teams. So it was kind of a fun one. You guys have any others?
I'm trying to wrap my head around. So it's basically like auction paddles they would hold up?
Yeah, like dry erase.
That's pretty wild. Yeah. I never thought of that.
Cheap, kind of a fun thing to send around. And you can use them for different things too, outside of pointing that you would have people sketch or hold up or write or hold up.
That's interesting.
I've never hacked anything together in that regard. I will say I'm a big proponent of, if you're talking and we have video, turn the video on. Because Colleen has met me in real life. I wildly gesticulate, and I'm very very emotional when I talk, and I make a lot of movements. And I think that if you can get people at least looking, first of all, it prevents people from multitasking, right? So when the video's turned off, they're either looking at their cell phone, they're answering a different email. Whereas when the video's on, I can say, hey, Colleen, I see you looking off to the left. What's over there? I'm a big fan of that because I think that actually helps you put the face to a voice. And I think that for me personally, that's the biggest thing. Get the video turned on. I don't care what you're wearing. I don't care if you did your hair, because I really want to make that connection. That's the biggest. I mean, if I had to offer advice to anybody, that's my 2 cents.
That sounds good. I think I can mention a hack that probably some tools out there have already mentioned it or have used this hack to implement the tools. It's for retrospectives. So we have several different stages in retrospective, and one of them is gather data. The hack that I have used, if you can call it that at all, is to gather data asynchronously. So not call people into a meeting, have them turn on their camera and, write sticky notes on a virtual whiteboard, but instead gather data before people come to the meeting. So there are tools that make this possible right now. But before I knew about any of those tools, I would still have people putting their Post-it notes beforehand and then come to the meeting to only have the conversation for generating insights and moving on from there.
I like it. I'm a big fan of that one too.
I'm glad you brought that up, Molood, because that was one of the things I had to post it on my desk of all the things I wanted to ask, and I forgot to bring it with me. Retrospectives, and what are sorry, Colleen, if I'm taking us in a different direction, but what are some of the things you would suggest in your experience that to make retrospectives more fulfilling when you do have remote people, where it's hard that when you don't have everybody in the room trying to gather once. You just talked about, asynchronous data gathering prior to, which I think that's great. Any other tips or tricks you could offer people on making that a more effective ceremony when people are spread out all over the place?
In remote teams, we always say focus on the result, focus on what you get out of whatever scenario. You're not being measured by the number of hours that you put into creating those results, but you're actually being measured by how much result you're creating. Same applies to retrospectives. Retrospectives that do not have actions out of them, they tend to become boring and become frustrating after a while. And when they are done remotely, they are extra frustrating to people, because that means sitting in front of a camera and having to go through, jitter and bad internet and all of that for a lot of people. So one thing that I think we should do, so we talked about gathering data asynchronously, and another thing that I could mention about retrospectives is to make sure that you have an outcome out of the retrospective, because if you don't have an outcome, if you don't have an action that is decided upon, people are going to be frustrated. And the next thing is related to something we mentioned beforehand when we were talking about Office Manager and Scrum Master. Make sure that the actions are followed through. Add them to the backlog, or, these are tips that we also say for collocated teams, but they become extra sensitive when your team is not sitting together. If you're making a decision, if you're taking a decision to have an action point, make sure that you follow through.
Okay. That makes sense.
I don't know. Do you want me to add something?
No, that's a good point, because like you said, we have these retros and we have all these great ideas, but you need to ensure that, okay, well, let's actually deliver on what we talked about, as opposed to just, navel gazing and coming up with all these philosophical ideas that nobody ever implements.
Yeah.
Well, I know we're nearing the end of our time here, and I want to give our guests a chance to share any upcoming events. We talked about the Remote Forever Summit. Molood, can you share with our listeners a little bit more about when that takes place and where they can find out more information on the speakers and the topics?
Absolutely. The Remote Forever Summit in 2018 is happening on November 5th to 11th. So if you're listening to this podcast after that date, make sure that you register for the next one. That is 1 year after that. Hopefully this will be an annual event. It's free to attend, so you can go to remoteforeversummit.com and register for free. You'll be able to watch all the sessions as they go live. Some sessions are pre-recorded, some are actually live, happening with the speaker being with you and interacting with you. There is an open space session on the Saturday of the event. That's November 10th. And there are extra workshops by returning speakers where you can deep dive and learn from the speakers, in their own way of teaching, in their own classroom. So it's going to be a lot of interactions with attendees. There's networking possibilities. And yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. So that's the event. Yeah.
I'm excited to hear how your open space goes, Molood. That'll be a really interesting concept.
I am excited about that too. It's so scary, right?
What are the best ways for our listeners to get in touch with you?
You can contact me through the contact form of remoteforeversummit.com, or you can go to my website. That's remoteforever.com. And you can also find me on social media, on LinkedIn. Most of the people find me there. I am probably one of the very few Moloods who is a woman, because it's also a name for a guy, and apparently it's more common for guys. And on Twitter, I go with @MoloodNuri.
Great. Jay, do you have anything you want to share as we close out here?
I have nothing exciting to add, except you can find me on the Coalition. You can find me on Twitter at Backdoor Agile. And we've got all I will throw out is that we have some really interesting podcast material coming up, aside from this one, which I thought was great. We have some projects we're taking our podcast in a couple of new directions. So just give a little bit of teaser there. But otherwise, that's it for me, Colleen.
Great. Well, thanks again to Molood and to you, our listening audience. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a review, a rating, or leave some comments on iTunes or Stitcher. It helps others find us down the road. If this is your first time tuning in, maybe consider subscribing to our podcast. If you'd like to join the discussion and share your stories around Agile, remote teams, or tools, please join us on coalition.agileuprising.com. And finally, support from listeners like you helps us cover our hosting and production costs. So see our show notes for details on how you can become a patron. Until next time, this is the Agile Uprising podcast signing out. Thanks all.